Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 weapon guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering the 20 best weapons in Act 3 for Honor Mode. In parts 1 and 2 of this video, I covered Acts 1 and 2, so of course you can go check those out, where I go over how I'm rating these items and everything, and all the best items in the earlier acts. But today we're covering Act 3, including all the most powerful weapons in the game. In fact, the weapons in this act are so good, I could probably do a whole video like top 20 weapons I had to cut from the top 20 list. At this point, you know the drill, so we're pretty much gonna dive right in. But before I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Tarantula for the $10 donation, His Pain My Gain for the $5, Hidden Fossil for the £10, and CS Army and Matt Without Fear for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really do appreciate the support, and sorry if I mispronounced anyone's name. Alright, let's talk weapons. I'm going to start with 3 honorable mentions, and for the Act 3 weapons, I decided to use the honorable mentions category to talk about the weapons that aren't available through normal gameplay, but that you can still grab through exploits or sequences of clever actions in order to pick them up anyways. These weapons aren't like super intended to be used by players, but you can still do it without modding or cheating or anything like that, so they're very much worth talking about, even if you don't encounter them during a normal play session. The first of these is going to be the Trident of the Depths. The Trident of the Depths is an awesome +3 trident, so an incredibly powerful weapon. Trident also is a pretty good chassis for a weapon to have. It's a thrown weapon, and it has pretty good weapon action, so it's an all-around very useful weapon. And this one comes from the Water Myrmidon. The Myrmidon summons that you can summon as a level 10 druid, or as a level 11 druid, or turn into as a level 10 Circle of the Moon druid, have weapons, and they have the permanently armed condition, meaning that you normally can't disarm the weapons from them, but there's a couple ways to get them, mostly involving getting arrested and then taking the weapon out of the evidence chest afterwards. The Trident of the Depths is from the Water Myrmidon, and it's a +3 trident that does an extra d6 of cold damage on every single attack, which is already a really powerful weapon by itself. Cold damage, of course, is excellent in Baldur's Gate 3 because it can be doubled with the wet condition, it synergizes with a whole lot of stuff, you can use it to turn puddles of water on the ground into ice, which can cause enemies to fall prone, so just having cold damage available in your party is super strong, and a lot of parties are themed around cold and lightning damage as a result, making this a great weapon. This weapon also comes with the Hyamel Strike weapon action, which does a ton of extra cold damage and inflicts chill on enemies. It's usable at will, there's no short rest cooldown, so you can use this every turn, but it does take your full action rather than an attack, so if you have extra attack, you can only use Hyamel Strike, not that and another attack. That is, by the way, how you say Hyamel. It's 3 syllables, and it means wintry. The Hyamel Strike action is incredible because chilling an enemy and doing a ton of extra cold damage is great, and the chilled condition turns into the frozen condition if you then get the enemy wet. You have to apply chill first and then soak them in water, but then they freeze, which stuns them, which means that this weapon can apply stuns effectively at will. This is an incredibly powerful tool for any party that's centered around cold damage and the wet condition, and will be really good. It's especially good for characters that don't have extra attack, but are still attacking with weapons, such as, for example, a Spore Druid can use the Trident of the Depths and benefit massively from the Hyamel Strike action without actually giving up anything because they don't have extra attack to lose. This is a super powerful tool. In my opinion, this is the least abusive of the exploit weapons, and so I actually think that this weapon should just be obtainable in the game. I think it's totally balanced with the other weapons available in the game, has a bunch of cool synergies and stuff, but you do have to do an exploit to get it, so we're putting it in honorable mentions, but building a strategy around this weapon is both fun and very powerful. Our second honorable mention, and another weapon that comes from a Myrmidon, is even more powerful, and that is the Flail of the Vortex. This is a +3 flail that does an extra d8 of lightning damage on every single attack, making it an incredibly powerful weapon just for attacking with. Again, just like cold damage, lightning damage can be doubled with the wet condition, so this synergizes very, very well with any party that is going to be centering their strategy around the wet condition. It also comes with the Electrified Flail weapon action, which is very similar to High Immel Strike from the Trident of the Depths, but instead of chilling an enemy, it stuns them. You can use this at will. It again takes your entire action rather than just a weapon action, but you can at will stun an enemy, and at will stun on a +3 weapon with a bunch of extra damage is of course incredible. It's resource free, so it's even better than Stunning Strike in a lot of circumstances, especially if you have a character that doesn't have extra attack and so isn't losing anything by just using this ability every turn. At will stun is ridiculous. Enemies do get a saving throw against it, but even if it goes off only half the time, that's half the turns that your enemies are just not taking turns, and so the Flail of the Vortex is going to break combats wide open. This one, I think, is a little more on the abusive side for an exploit, of course, but still, I think, within reason for a weapon, so this is just personal opinion. I think this is usable in a more or less balanced honor mode run. It's not like wildly more powerful than weapons that are available by default, but it is very, very good. And obviously stunning an enemy every turn is super powerful, so the Flail of the Vortex is going to be awesome for any party that uses it. And finally, the last of our 3 honorable mentions, the Deva Mace. The Deva Mace is a mace with no enhancement bonus, so it won't hit as often as other weapons that have bonus to hit, but when it does hit, it hits like an absolute truck. It does, of course, normal mace damage, but then 4d8 radiant damage on every single attack. So you can whack an enemy with this for basically a Paladin Smite every single attack that you make. Of course, you can then combine it with Paladin Smite for double smite on every turn, and because this is a one-handed weapon, you can use it with the dual wielder feat and have 2 of these, and be hitting with your offhand as well for 4d8 radiant damage for even more damage. This is the sort of highest per turn damage in the game that you can get. I did a build based around this one. To talk about the highest damage character in Baldur's Gate 3, and this is the weapon that it uses in order to get the maximum damage. The fact that this is radiant damage is of course important for various synergies, like radiating orbs, which are an incredibly useful debuff for enemies, but you don't really need to debuff enemies when you're doing this much damage, because you'll kill them, and of course, because it is damage dice that you're adding in addition, these damage dice get doubled if you critically hit, so a critical hit with a Deva Mace does 2d6 plus 8d8 effectively radiant damage, which is going to like one-shot half the enemies in the game, and only needs a couple attacks in order to kill even the strongest bosses in the game. This weapon is so good because it just does way too much damage. This is just more damage than any other weapon in the game is allowed to do, and it's not really intended to be used by players for good reason because of how much damage it does. This is definitely on the more broken end of the exploit scale. So if you use this, you can expect to overpower encounters. I will say that you want to use this on a character that has high hit chance or bonuses to its hit chance, because the weapon doesn't give you any bonuses to hit chance. But if you do, and you hit consistently with this weapon, you're going to do like 3 times as much damage as any other character is capable of, and obviously that breaks the game wide open. Obviously, top tier weapon for the sheer amount of damage it does, though of course you do have to do an exploit in order to get it. And weighing in at number 20, a weapon that enables an entire category of builds all by itself, the Dancing Breeze. The Dancing Breeze is a +2 glaive with an AoE attack, so it has the whirlwind attack that allows you to attack a lot of enemies in a large AoE. But the really interesting thing about the Dancing Breeze is that unlike any other polearm in the game, it is a finesse weapon, meaning you can use your dexterity to attack with it and deal damage with it. That means that characters have a ton more options for builds, and so the Dancing Breeze enables an entire category of builds, finesse glaive users, or finesse polearm characters, finesse great weapon characters, to work all on its own. The existence of this weapon just enables a whole category of characters to exist that couldn't otherwise. It's obviously extremely powerful for finesse builds, and it's especially good if you are building around Sentinel, because it's a reach weapon. You can also build around Polearm Master with it and do the Sentinel Polearm Master combo without having to have strength, meaning that that can go on different categories of classes. You can do that on, for example, a Sword Bard who doesn't want to invest in strength, and still have this character be extremely effective. Now, obviously, if you are using strength elixirs to get strength, then it doesn't matter that you have a finesse weapon. The Dancing Breeze is a little redundant with the existence of the strength elixirs in the game. So if you're using a lot of strength elixirs for your melee characters, you won't need this weapon. But for parties that aren't built around strength elixirs, or that want to enable an entire category of builds, the Dancing Breeze is awesome, and I wanted to include this weapon because it's just so cool that there's a whole set of builds that couldn't exist without it. Moving on to number 19, we have Gontr Mael. Gontr Mael is a legendary bow, so it might seem a little odd to see it all the way down at 19, but remember that this is Act 3 weapons, so the quality of weapons that we've got here is so incredibly high that you see even legendary weapons this far down the list. Gontr Mael is a +3 longbow with a ton of abilities. You can see here I had to heavily edit the wiki entry to get it to fit in this presentation, and that's always a good sign for a weapon. Firstly, it lets you cast Celestial Haste once per long rest, which gives you 5 turns of haste, and importantly, unlike other haste, it doesn't stun you when it ends, so there's no penalty to using Celestial Haste. The tooltip here says at will, but it's on a long rest cooldown, so it's once per long rest. But having a haste effect that doesn't stun you if you were to lose concentration or when the potion ends, like other haste effects do, is pretty powerful in and of itself. Secondly, whenever you hit an enemy with it, they have to make a dex save, a DC 15 dexterity save, or they get the guiding bolt effect, which gives your next attack from any character against that enemy advantage, so you're going to hit more often with this weapon, of course, especially as you make subsequent attacks. But the real power of this weapon is the Bolt of Celestial Light ability, which does a bunch of extra radiant damage and infuses the bow with an effect that for 10 turns makes every attack you do with it do an extra d4 of radiant damage. This is a very powerful weapon action, and it's on a short rest, so you can activate Bolt of Celestial Light, frighten an enemy, which is very good for an archer because it stops them from moving, and then do a bunch of additional damage. Now, it must be said that Gontr Mael is, in my opinion, the 3rd best bow in the game, but it still makes an excellent weapon. I do think it typically loses out to the Titan String bow in terms of damage and the Deadshot in terms of accuracy, but it has a bunch of utility, so if you're building around radiating orbs as an archer, then it's going to be incredible there, and it is more accurate than the Deadshot, so if you are struggling with hitting your shots, which is often what archers need to do, because a lot of their damage comes from Sharpshooter, then you can swap from the Titan String to this. And it's also worth noting that the Deadshot is highly in demand for non-archer characters as well. We'll talk about that when we get to that weapon a little later on. Spoilers. You may end up with your archer using Gontr Mael while another character has the Deadshot for the passive effect. So this weapon is very, very powerful for parties that need haste, parties with archers that want the Deadshot on a different character, and also just if you want to use the super cool legendary Longbow. While I do think that the other bows are very slightly better, I think the difference is very marginal, and Gontr Mael is still an extremely powerful weapon that also gives you a bunch of really awesome options. Weighing in at number 18, Dolor Amarus. Dolor Amarus is a +2 dagger that whenever you deal a critical hit, you do an extra 7 damage. This applies to critical hits that you do with this weapon, but importantly, it also applies to critical hits that you do not with this weapon. So an archery character can use Dolor Amarus in order to do extra damage with their bow shots whenever they score a critical hit. Now, generally speaking, for critical builds, you'd prefer the weapons that give you additional chance to critical. Over the Dolor Amarus, you will generally improve your damage more by improving your critical hit chance rather than adding the 7 extra damage. But there are 2 cases where this is an incredibly good weapon. The first, of course, is that you can use multiple of these. There's actually more than one in the game, as you can see here. And that can let you stack +14 damage on your critical hits, which adds a ton of damage whenever you get critical hits. And the second is for characters that have guaranteed critical hits, so they don't need the crit chance, and can instead focus on dealing additional damage with them. This is especially good, of course, for assassin rogues, which automatically critical hit on their opening attacks in combat. And so the Dolor Amarus is going to add 7 damage to all of those attacks for assassin rogues, making it incredible. And so if you are an archery assassin character, which is a very common build setup and an incredibly powerful one for Honor Mode. Wielding 2 of these as your melee weapon slot gives you the passive benefits of plus 14 damage on every critical hit, which improves your damage dramatically. You're basically getting Sharpshooter and a half for free, on top of course, already having Sharpshooter, as long as you have automatic critical hits. You can also use this with other effects that give you guaranteed criticals, like the Luck of the Far Realms Illithid power, in order to stack even more critical damage. This is also pretty good expected damage, even if you just equip it instead of a weapon that gives you increased crit chance. If you want that weapon on a different character, it's still very, very good for critical builds with archers. The plus 7 damage doesn't work on non-weapon attacks, so you do need to be using it for an archery character. I should have added archer in the good for section here, because melee critical builds will definitely prefer other daggers, but for an archery character with guaranteed criticals, this is a huge amount of extra damage, and will spike that character's already ridiculous damage to truly nonsensical levels. Coming in at number 17, the Silver Sword of the Astral Plane. This plus 3 Greatsword deals an extra d6 of psychic damage whenever it's used by a Githyanki. And if you are a Githyanki using it, you have advantage on all of your mental saving throws, resistance to psychic damage, and immunity to charm. Now, of course, you don't actually have to be playing a Githyanki in order to use this weapon, and it doesn't have to be on Lae'zel specifically, although she can, of course, use it as a Githyanki herself. But any character can use Disguise Self to disguise as a Githyanki in order to benefit from this, from the effects of this weapon. And like most of the weapons that require you to disguise, you only have to disguise when you equip it, and you'll still get the benefits even if you then dismiss the disguise, so you don't have to run around looking like a Gith all the time, if that doesn't appeal to you. This weapon's really interesting because for a super powerful offensive weapon like a greatsword, you would expect it to be an offensively focused weapon, but it's actually a much more defensively focused weapon. While a plus 3 greatsword with an extra d6 of psychic damage is obviously a pretty powerful weapon, it's definitely not as high damage as the other great weapons that you have available at this point. So it makes up for this with the extremely powerful defensive buffs. If you have any character that needs help with their mental saving throws, which of course a lot of great weapon characters can struggle in that area, because most fighters, barbarians, etc. don't naturally get proficiency in intelligence, wisdom, or charisma saves, so you can mitigate those characters' weaknesses with the Silver Sword. You probably need to do this in combination with some bonuses to your saving throws, just some numerical bonuses as well, because if you have a plus 0 bonus on wisdom, for example, the advantage from the Silver Sword will not be enough to reliably pass wisdom saves, so you will need to also increase your wisdom saving throws. There's a bunch of encounters in the game where enemies will charm you or deal psychic damage, and so those effects are also being immune to those effects is also great, just passively. There are spells that can duplicate those things, but the Silver Sword just gives it to you all the time. This weapon also does lose some value if you are using Hero's Feast as a day-long buff, because that gives you advantage on wisdom saves already, which is like the main benefit of this weapon. So parties that are using Hero's Feast, which I do recommend that most parties do on Honor Mode, will get less value out of the Silver Sword. If you have a great weapon character that needs an increase in its saving throws, the Silver Sword is incredible, though. It's an excellent way to do that, and it gives you a lot of defensive utility and safety for some of the hardest encounters in the game, including many boss fights. In addition, it also comes with a once per short rest weapon action, Soulbreaker, which lets you stun an enemy once per short rest, and stuns on a weapon action are really, really good. It's the same action as the Soulbreaker Greatsword, which of course I recommended very highly as an Act 1 weapon. And this ability is no less good in Act 3, at least in terms of its power level, though some Act 3 bosses are immune to it, so you'll get a lot of value from the stun, but less than you would have in earlier acts. Overall, this is just the total package as a weapon. It gives you really solid offense and incredible defense. Usually, I'm going to want to focus a character who's using great weapons more on offense, so I will prefer one of the other great weapons that we'll get to later, but it's also worth noting that you can get this weapon quite early in the act, and so can use it before you can get to some of the more powerful weapons available later in the act, and it'll be very helpful there. One other thing that's worth mentioning about the Silver Sword is, of course, there is an exploit to get this weapon in Act 1. Larian have tried to patch this out many, many times without success, and so it is still possible to exploit the game to just acquire this weapon in Act 1. Obviously, a legendary Act 3 weapon, if you get it in Act 1, is ludicrously broken, so of course, if you get it early, then you're going to use it for the entire game, but we're evaluating it here when you're supposed to get it in Act 3. Moving on to number 16, we have Ambusher. Ambusher is a +1 short sword that gives you a +1 bonus to your initiative, advantage on perception checks, which mostly doesn't matter, but I guess is a nice little bonus, and an extra d6 of necrotic damage on every attack against any enemy that hasn't taken a turn yet. This extra d6 of necrotic damage works on all of your weapon attacks. It won't work on spells, so you can't use it to, deal a ridiculous amount of damage with Scorching Ray or Magic Missile, but it will work on archery attacks, it'll work on your second weapon if you're dual wielding, so you can use this to get a whole bunch of extra damage. Firstly, +1 to initiative as a passive benefit is always great. Any character can benefit from this, and especially if they don't really need to attack with their melee weapons, then the +1 initiative may just be an incredible boon for those characters if they need to boost their initiative. I already talked about how good these passive bonuses to initiative are on weapons, and you'll have seen those weapons appear super high up in the tier lists for earlier acts. Ambusher I've put a little lower down because by Act 3, most characters will have enough options to increase their initiative that spending a weapon slot on it is a real cost. But if you use both the initiative and the extra d6 of necrotic damage on this weapon, then it's going to be incredible. The best character to do that with is any archery character, because going first is great for archers, and the extra d6 of necrotic damage on all of your bow shots is a huge amount of additional damage. Especially good, of course, for assassin rogues, because you're guaranteed to critically hit with your shots against enemies that haven't gone yet, and that doubles the 1d6 necrotic damage to 2d6 necrotic damage, increasing your damage dramatically. It's the same average damage added on a critical hit as Dolor Amarus, but with an additional bonus as well. So the Ambusher is, in general, I think a little bit better for assassin rogues, though both are very powerful, and of course, they are light finesse weapons, so you can just use both. The fact that this is a one-handed light finesse weapon that gives you an awesome passive benefit, so you don't need dual wielder or anything to take advantage of this and another weapon with a super powerful passive effect, makes it awesome, and I think it is going to be a rare party that doesn't have a use for this weapon, and a party with an assassin rogue archer is going to get a lot of use out of this weapon. Coming in at number 15, the Sacred Star. The Sacred Star is a +2 Morning Star that deals an extra d4 of radiant damage on every attack, as well as inflicting 1 turn of Radiating Orb, so you can stack it with additional sources of Radiating Orb to inflict a lot of Radiating Orb on every single attack. In addition to that, it has a couple other cool effects. I had to cut it for space in the cut it from the wiki entry for space in the presentation. But as a Morning Star, of course, the Sacred Star has the Heartstopper weapon action, which lets you remove 1 action from an enemy for 2 turns, which is one of the most powerful debuffs in the game. A little bit less good in Act 3 when many enemies have multiple actions, but still vastly reduces the effectiveness of dangerous enemies if you landed on them, and will be able to turn entire encounters on its own. It's also not resisted by a lot of enemies that resist other stuns, so Heartstopper is very, very good even on into the late game. And Radiating Orb is just an incredibly powerful strategy. Characters that are built around Radiating Orb and also making weapon attacks, this is the best in slot weapon for those characters because it stacks Orb by itself, gives you radiant damage to stack more Orb, and also gives you a bunch of powerful debuffs, which is what those characters usually want to do. Undead creatures that get hit by the weapon have to make a save or become turned, so you can easily win fights against undead with this. There aren't that many fights against undead with the in Act 3, but it's useful for those fights. And you have a short rest weapon action that lets you create an AoE blind. Now, it's a DC 13 Constitution save, so most enemies are going to pass this AoE blind, but it's still a nice little bonus, and it does extra radiant damage. The main benefit here, though, is that you have a huge amount of debuffs available with this weapon, stacks Radiating Orb really, really easily, and that's one of the most powerful things you can do in Honor Mode, and lets you just wear down bosses very quickly with the negatives to hit they get from the Radiating Orbs, plus all of the debuffs that you're adding to them with Dawnburst Strike and Heartstopper. This weapon will make a lot of boss fights vastly easier, so any fight that's going to go multiple turns, this weapon is an all-star in. At number 14, the Crimson Mischief. The Crimson Mischief is another legendary weapon, and in this case it is a legendary short sword, meaning it can be dual-wielded easily alongside a dagger or another finesse weapon. It's a +2 short sword. It's one of the only legendary weapons that isn't +3, which is interesting, just a neat fact about it. And it does an extra d4 necrotic damage on every attack. Against enemies, it also has, against enemies with half of their hit points or less, it does an extra d4 of piercing damage, and that's added as a separate damage die, so it will also be doubled on critical hits. It will itself trigger damage riders, the extra d4 of piercing damage, so on lower difficulty settings, this can add additional damage riders several times, because you can get it from the d6, from the d4, and from the other d4. And so you can get like a lot of damage with things like Falar Aluv with the Crimson Mischief. Even on Honor Mode, though, this is a huge amount of damage for one weapon. It also has two cool magical effects, which depend on whether it's in your main hand or your offhand. If you use it in your main hand, whenever you attack with advantage, the enemy takes an extra 7 piercing damage. And again, this is a damage rider, so it can stack additional damage, damage rider source, so it can stack additional damage from Falar Aluv or whatever. And doubles up extra damage from Dolor Amarus and things like that as well. You can stack ridiculous amounts of damage with this ability. It's not that hard to attack with advantage in Act 3. There's lots of ways to get advantage on all of your attacks. And if you use it in your offhand, you basically get the 2-weapon fighting style for free, letting you add your ability modifier to the damage. This doesn't stack with the 2-weapon fighting style, so if you have that from being a bard or fighter who picks that up, then you definitely don't want this in your offhand. Either way, I think the Crimson Mischief's main hand ability is much more powerful than the offhand ability, so typically you're going to want it in your main hand when you are dual-wielding this weapon. This is a weapon for dual-wielding characters. There's not really other characters that want it, but if you are dual-wielding 2 weapons, this is the highest damage weapon in the game and is just best in slot for dual-wielders in terms of doing damage, making it an incredibly powerful weapon. Next up, the opposite of a dual-wielding only weapon, the Duellist's Prerogative. The Duellist Prerogative has, again, so many different abilities that I had to cut several of them from the Wiki entry in order to fit it in this video. But it is a +3 rapier that does an additional d4 of necrotic damage on every attack. As a rapier, it's a finesse weapon, of course, so you can use it with your dexterity, which is what you're typically going to be doing, and it has a ton of abilities. Firstly, you can basically cast the Paladin spell Compelled Duel on an enemy, giving them disadvantage to attack enemies that aren't you. That's not a huge benefit, but it is a nice little addition if you have a character that wants to tank. Mostly the challenge to duel spell isn't that impressive, though. The thing that is impressive is that it boosts your critical hit chance by 1, so you will critically hit more often when you're using this weapon, and gives you an extra reaction every turn, which is incredibly powerful. I'll come back to that in a second. And whenever you hit with a melee weapon, you can use a reaction to deal extra necrotic damage, usually +4 necrotic damage equal to your proficiency bonus. That's honestly not a very good use of a reaction, and I'd typically avoid using Withering Cut, because you will want your 2 reactions for other things if you're building around this weapon. Finally, if you have an empty offhand, then you can make an extra attack with it as a bonus action, meaning that you basically get to 2-weapon fight, but with only a main hand weapon equipped. This weapon by itself creates an entire category of builds, characters that have 1 main hand weapon and nothing equipped in their offhand, and this is the weapon that enables that strategy, so it's pretty cool that there's a whole category of builds that this weapon enables. And it is a very powerful tool. It's just a very high damage weapon, so you will get a lot of damage out of it. It's a little lower damage than some of the other options, or than like a strong two-weapon or two-handed setup in terms of actual damage output, but the additional effects that it gives you are incredibly strong for a variety of builds. The main one here is the additional reaction, which is nonsensically powerful. An extra reaction every turn gives you so much agency in combat and allows you to do so much. It's especially great for Sentinel builds, which are built around making opportunity attacks as a reaction. Enemies who are trying to run away from you, you can lock in place with Sentinel. So the Duellist Prerogative is going to allow you to do that multiple times per turn. Characters with counterspell or cutting words benefit a ton from having multiple reactions as well. So a Bladelock character that has counterspell as a warlock spell has multiple reactions, which it can use to both make opportunity attacks or deal a little bit of extra damage. I mean, Withering Cut's not a great reaction, but if you're not going to use it for something else, then it's still good. And most importantly, counterspell with their spells. Spore Druids, very similar, and Spore Druids also have not with the counterspell, but Spore Druids will be wanting to make weapon attacks, benefit a ton from the Duelist Prerogative just being a very good weapon, since it can let them apply their Spore Druid damage as well, and also have a bunch of unique reactions that you can use multiple times per turn with the Duelist Prerogative. Lorebard, and especially Lorebard multiclasses, Paladin builds, and anything built around using this weapon benefit a ton from this. An extra reaction is just an incredibly versatile and powerful tool. Unless you are building around the Duelist Prerogative, you usually will want to go with a different weapon, but if you build around it, it's so incredibly strong that it's very much worth doing that. Coming in at number 12, the Vicious Shortbow. The Vicious Shortbow is a +2 shortbow that has the same passive as Dolor Amarus, where whenever you deal a critical hit, you deal an extra 7 damage. The trick here is that you don't use this as a bow, because this is a passive that applies to your melee weapon attacks. So for any build built around melee criticals, this just adds 7 extra damage every time you get them. It's especially good if you're an assassin rogue as a melee character, because that basically uses a weapon slot that you aren't using, your bow slot, if you're making melee weapon attacks, in order to boost your damage output on every critical hit you get, and you're guaranteed to get critical hits. A lot of critical builds will prefer the Deadshot, but the Deadshot, as I mentioned previously, is highly in demand, and this makes a good alternative to that if you have multiple characters that care about critical hits in a party, which is not unusual. And also, for any character with guaranteed criticals, the Vicious Shortbow is a huge amount of bonus damage. Just like all of the other bows that provide passive effects, this uses a weapon slot that a lot of characters don't care about taking up, so you get a ton of free value from having this equipped, and it increases the damage of any critical hit character dramatically. Weighing in at number 11, just outside the top 10, which should give you some idea of how good the top 10 is going to be, we have the Staff of Spellpower. The Staff of Spellpower gives you a +1 to your spell save DCs and spell attack rolls, which is of course pretty useful for a staff, although we already have options for that from earlier acts, so by itself that wouldn't be very exciting. The main thing that the Staff of Spellpower gives you, though, is the Arcane Battery ability, allowing you to cast a spell, the next spell you cast, without spending a spell slot. The trick here is that you don't have to do this in combat, so you can cast a level 6 spell without spending a spell slot for a day-long buff, something like Hero's Feast or a Myrmidon summon, or any other of the level 6 summons, can give you an incredibly powerful day-long buff, making your whole adventuring day that much stronger without spending a real resource. So the Staff of Spellpower gives you a huge amount of additional longevity. If you rest after every fight, if you're a player who rests very frequently, you won't need this weapon as often, although it can still be used to give you multiple casts of level 6 spells in a fight, which is very powerful, though there are other options for doing that with more powerful weapons. But for any player who doesn't rest frequently, this is a huge bonus to your adventuring longevity. A level 6 spell slot is the most important resource in the game, and this gives you more of them, making it incredibly strong. And moving on to the top 10 weapons in Honor Mode, starting with number 10, the Hellfire Greataxe. The Hellfire Greataxe is a +2 Greataxe that does an extra d6 of fire damage on every single attack, And whenever you deal damage with it, gives you 2 turns of heat. Heat can stack up and then be discharged to deal extra damage on your next action, extra fire damage, and it'll hit anything that you hit with that next attack all at once. So if you do AoE damage, all the heat will be discharged into a single enemy, or into every enemy that you hit with it for a bunch of extra damage. By itself, at base, this weapon isn't that exciting. I mean, a +2 Greataxe with an extra d6 of damage is pretty powerful, but because it is fire damage, it does conflict with being able to dip your weapons in fire, and because it's a burning weapon, you can't use weapon coatings with it, so you will have less success if you want to use poisons or other coatings, because the Hellfire Greataxe is incompatible with them. But it also comes with the best short rest weapon action in the game in Hellfire Cleave. This does a massive AoE damage attack for a huge amount of damage, your normal weapon damage and a bunch of extra damage, and spews fire everywhere for a massive bonus to damage output. So against any fight with multiple enemies in it, the Hellfire Greataxe will just clear them all out in a single swing. It's also not a bad weapon just to use as a weapon itself. I mean, it's slightly weaker than the Silver Sword of the Astral Plane or than another two-handed weapon that will show up a little bit later in the list when you are actually swinging it. But when you're activating Hellfire Cleave, or Hellflame Cleave, actually, you are getting the best action that you can do with pretty much anything. Hellflame Cleave is funny also because it's a spell, which means that a sorcerer can quicken it, and it can be counterspelled. It has a bunch of other weird interactions, but the main thing is just that it does a berserk amount of fire damage in a single action, basically giving you a fireball on every short rest that's also a weapon attack, so it's going to do ludicrous amounts of damage. It's best, of course, for great weapon characters, because you need to be a two-handed character to use it, and for anybody who wants AoE damage, and in any encounter where you need an AoE swing, this is the absolute best-in-class weapon, so it's going to come in for those encounters, or just be used full-time, and you will always be able to get huge amounts of value out of Hellflame Cleave. Coming in at number 9, the Dwarven Thrower. The Dwarven Thrower is a +2 Warhammer, but unlike other Warhammers, it has the Thrown weapon property, meaning that it will do its normal weapon damage whenever you throw it, and it also is a homing weapon, it's a returning weapon, so it's going to come back to you and re-equip on your character whenever you throw it. If you are a dwarf throwing it, and just like every other weapon with a racial requirement, if you disguise as a dwarf when you equip it, then you will get the benefits of it. Now, unlike other weapons where you can just disguise and then dismiss it, you have to stay disguised as a dwarf because you're throwing this weapon, so it's going to be unequipped and re-equipped to your character a lot, and it does the check for whether you're a dwarf or not every time. But the Dwarven Thrower will do an extra d8 of damage, of bludgeoning damage, and against large enemies, an extra 2d8 of bludgeoning damage, large or larger enemies. This is the best single-target throwing damage weapon in the game, and throwing characters are pretty much the best single-target damage characters in the game, so this is the best-in-slot weapon for the thing that the character is best at, giving them a tremendous amount of value. Obviously, the question for this weapon is, how does it stack up against Nyrulna, the other top-tier throwing weapon? And in general, I think it's a little more niche. Nyrulna's AoE, I think, and passive benefits gives it a little bit more use, but either or both are going to be an incredibly powerful tool for a thrower, one of the best characters in Baldur's Gate 3, and so any throwing weapon character is going to use this for incredible value. You do have to disguise yourself or be playing a dwarf, but if you do that, then the amount of damage you get from this is ridiculous. This is just a weapon that does the most damage to single enemies for a character that does the most damage, so it's one of the best weapons in the game, because damage is what weapons are for, and this does a ton of it. And speaking of damage, let's talk the actual highest damage weapon in the game, Balduran's Giantslayer. Balduran's Giantslayer is a +3 greatsword that doubles your strength modifier to damage and gives you advantage when you're attacking large enemies. It also lets you become gigantic, giving you temporary hit points and additional damage with your giant form ability that you can use once per short rest. So in most encounters, you can deal an extra d6 of damage, plus double your strength modifier, plus be attacking with advantage. And on a short rest weapon action, you can also do a tremendous amount of additional damage to large enemies, and of course, large enemies or larger enemies are some of the more dangerous enemies in the game. Now, this is a pretty late game weapon. You do have to pass a pretty difficult encounter in order to pick up this weapon, but when you do, it is going to up the damage of your character to the maximum possible level, because this weapon just does the most damage of any great weapon in the game, and great weapon characters are one of the highest damage possible setups. For a great weapon character, this is just the best in slot. The Hellfire Greataxe is good for AoE, the Silver Sword is good if you need a more defensive setup, but if you just want damage, Balduran's Giantslayer is the way to go. It's especially good if you are using Elixirs of Cloud Giant Strength to get your strength up to 27, because then you add double the damage from your strength modifier, which is plus 8. So you're going to be adding plus 16 damage with the Balduran Giantslayer, in addition to any other benefits you have, probably plus another 10 from Great Weapon Master and a bunch of other effects. So the amount of damage that this weapon does per swing is just ridiculous. If you need to overcome enemy damage reduction also, like an enemy has flat damage reduction, which a couple Act 3 enemies do, then Balduran's Giantslayer will do so much damage per swing that you're going to overcome that damage reduction very, very easily. This weapon, late in the game, but so good that it is going to make any fight after you get it much easier, because it does just that much damage. Again, damage is good on weapons, and this does the most. So, if we've already covered the highest damage weapon, how can there possibly be 7 weapons that are better than the highest damage weapon? Well, let's take a look with weapon number 7, the Staff of Cherished Necromancy. The Staff of Cherished Necromancy is a +2 staff that does an extra d4 of necrotic damage, but none of that matters because you won't actually be attacking with it. The benefits of this weapon are the passive benefits that it has for spellcasters. Firstly, enemies have disadvantage on saves against your necromancy spells. Necromancy spells are mostly damaging spells, so this is less good than if it gave disadvantage on saves against School of Magic that had control spells in it. Like if it was giving enemies disadvantage against something really devastating like Hold Person or Command or Hypnotic Pattern, it would be better, but disadvantage on saves is still really powerful, so your necromancy spells are going to land and do their damage more often. As well, Eye Bite is a necromancy spell, and that is some really debilitating debuffs. For some reason, that phrase was very hard to say. Just try saying debilitating debuffs 5 times fast. And so disadvantage on saves against that is really good. The real benefit, though, is that whenever you kill an enemy with a spell, doesn't have to be a necromancy spell, any spell that you kill an enemy with, you get a charge of life essence, which can then be discharged to cast your next necromancy spell without spending a spell slot. So basically, you can use this, and as long as you're consistently killing enemies, you can cast high-level necromancy spells for free forever. That can be Eye Bite, as I mentioned, which is a 6th level spell, or Circle of Death, another 6th level spell. You can use Blight for single target damage, and consistently chain kills between enemies with Life Essence and then free spells forever. This lets a character that is spec'd into damaging spells, so it's going to be killing enemies with its spells, to trigger the effect, consistently cast high-level spells for free, letting you spam all day and never run out of spell slots, and always have high-level spells available for combat. Necromancy spells are weaker than other high-level spells, so this isn't as good as if you were able to spam other spells from other schools, but this is still a tremendous amount of free value and a huge amount of damage increase to your character. It's especially good if you are spec'd into Dual Wielder, which is fairly common for spellcasting characters, so you can use this alongside another staff to gain the benefits of increased spell save DC and accuracy and the other benefits of other staffs, while also getting the incredible amount of free resources that the Staff of Cherished Necromancy gives you in order to make your character just a battery of violence constantly. This item did used to be bugged, and the life essence wouldn't go away, so killing one enemy gave you infinite free spellcasts, but even though that bug has been fixed, it still gives you tons of free spellcasts every encounter, as long as you're spec'd into killing enemies, and as long as there's multiple enemies in an encounter, this is so much extra damage and so many free resources that it is an extremely top-tier weapon. Coming in at number 6, one of the weapons that I've probably mentioned the most number of times across all of my build videos, the Deadshot. I've already talked about this bow several times in this tier list already, which should give you some idea of just how good it is. It's a +2 longbow with 2 passive effects. The first is that it reduces the die you need to roll, the number you need to roll for a critical hit by 1, and this is incredible for any melee character that wants to get critical hits because it takes your ranged weapon slot and increases your critical hit chance. Melee or spellcasting character. This also works for a Great Old One Warlock, for example, to increase their critical hit chance, gets them more critical hits with their Great Old War, with their Eldritch Blast for more fears and stuff like that. So the passive benefit already makes this an incredibly powerful weapon, but it's also the best in slot bow for actually shooting with, because you double your proficiency bonus when you are making ranged attacks with it, so it has a +4 to hit with every attack, in addition to the +2 that it gives you normally. So your attacks will hit extremely reliably when you're using the Deadshot, and that's mostly what archers need to do. A lot of their damage comes from damage riders and comes from the sharpshooter feat. So just landing your attacks is the most important thing for archers, and also like special arrow effects and stuff like that. So just landing your shots is the most important thing, and the Deadshot is the most accurate bow, as it says in the name. So it is the best in slot bow for archers. The real question is, will you put this on an archery character to use the best in slot bow for archers in the end game, or will you put it on a non-archery character in order to benefit from the incredible value of the increased chance to critically hit? And that will depend a little bit on your party composition. If I have a dedicated archer in my party, I tend to use the Deadshot on the archery character because I like hitting my shots a lot. But the Titan String Bow or Gontr Mael do make reasonable replacements, so this can still go on a different character. But the Deadshot is just the best in slot offhand weapon for any character that's not using their ranged weapons. It's going to be one of the best bows that you can have equipped. And for any character that is using their ranged weapons, it's also the best bow, making it just the best bow in the game, and or the second best bow in the game. We'll talk about another one in a second here. And just an incredibly powerful weapon. At number 5, as we get into the top 5 weapons in Baldur's Gate 3 Act 3, we have the Bloodthirst. Bloodthirst is a +2 dagger, so another legendary weapon that's only a +2. It's the companion weapon of the Crimson Mischief. You get them both at the same time, but in my opinion, it is the better of the two by a fair margin. The reason for this is that it gives you True Strike, of course, which obviously no build from me would be complete without, and then it also has a bunch of other lesser effects that make it okay, I guess, but really we're here for the True Strike. The Bloodthirst gives you, if you have it in your offhand, +1 armor class. No matter where you have it equipped, it gives you increased chance to critically hit. So for any character that wants a passive benefit from their weapon set, having the Bloodthirst equipped in their offhand gives them +1 AC and +1 chance to critically hit, which is just the best passive benefit that you can get from a melee weapon, pretty much, in the entire game. This, combined with the Knife of the Undermountain King in your main hand, gives you +2 to critically hit, and is the normal setup for any archery character, or any character that just wants to get a lot of critical hits, which is a lot of characters in the game. You don't need any special effects for that, and you get a huge bonus to your stats, with bonus to AC and bonus to critical hit chance. In addition, this weapon is great if you actually use it as a weapon. If you have it in your offhand, then you get a riposte attack similar to the Battlemaster riposte, which gives you a reaction attack whenever an enemy misses you, doing a bunch of turning a reaction into an attack, which is something that's quite good for a dual weapon wielding character, because they often don't have amazing uses for their reactions, and so getting a reaction attack with the Bloodthirst is great. And if you have it in your main hand, then you can inflict vulnerability to piercing damage. Now, this does conflict a little bit because a lot of dual weapon characters, if you're using a 2-dagger setup, you probably are using the Ballast armor, which gives everything vulnerability to piercing. But if you don't have the Ballast armor, then having this in your main hand just doubles your damage output, which is obviously incredible by itself. The main benefit of the Bloodthirst, though, is as a passive stat stick for your offhand, because the amount of bonus stats that it gives you for a single offhand weapon slot is incredible. So this is both the best weapon for a dual-wielding character. This, combined with the Crimson Mischief, is the best setup for a 2-weapon character in the endgame, as it should be, because that's the legendary weapon set designed for that character type. And this, just as an offhand weapon for any character, is incredible. It also has a neat synergy with throwers because it's a bound weapon, so it comes back to you when you throw it. And throwers can benefit from having a dagger they can throw because it has a flat weapon trajectory, so it's less likely to intersect with terrain than other thrown weapons. So the Bloodthirst is a returning dagger, making it pretty useful as a backup weapon for throwers, so it's just nice for them. You can also have it equipped in your offhand and benefit from its passive effect while throwing your main hand weapon. So it's going to be really good for throwers if you have dual wielder or are throwing another light weapon. So Bloodthirst is just incredible for pretty much every kind of character, whether you're an archer, a spellcaster, a melee character, a throwing character, all the characters, they can all use this weapon to tremendous effect. Coming in at number 4, Nyrulna. This weapon has shown up in, 40 videos that I've made, because it's the best in slot throwing weapon, and it's also the best in slot weapon for attacking with, either one-handed or two-handed, for a lot of characters. This weapon is so versatile and so powerful, and you get it really early in Act 3 if you want to, that it is going to be a tremendous benefit to pretty much any playthrough. This is another one where I had to cut half of the wiki entry in order to fit all the things it does on the list, and in fact I cut several of its abilities, but just be aware that this weapon has so many abilities and they're all so good that it just does way more than any other weapon in the game. It's a +3 Trident that does an extra d6 of thunder damage, and of course, because this is thunder damage, it synergizes with reverberation builds, so you can stack reverberation with items that stack it when you do thunder damage for even more powerful effect on hitting enemies with this weapon. And when you throw it, it comes back, so it's a returning weapon, and creates an explosion at the location that deals a huge AoE thunder damage blast, which is a massive addition to your damage output for a thrown weapon character. Now, you do have to be a little careful with this because it will hit your allies, so sometimes the damage from this can be awkward. If enemies are really grouped together, you might want to use the Dwarven Thrower or another weapon that you have as a backup. But Nyrulna, enemies are really grouped together with your allies, I should say. If they're just grouped together, then this is a huge amount of additional damage. But against any encounter with multiple enemies, Nyrulna is going to be the best damage weapon for a thrown character, because 3d4 thunder damage in an AoE is great. Just a huge addition to the amount of damage you do. Next, you gain a bunch of passive benefits. 10 feet of bonus move speed, which stacks with Longstrider to give you a bunch of extra move speed, and 10 feet of bonus jump distance, making your character much more mobile, which is very useful for every character in the game. And immunity to falling damage, which is less useful in Act 3. Of course, these things won't matter as much if you are going illithid in Act 3, because you'll have the mobility from fly, but for parties that aren't doing that, the mobility is a huge benefit. In addition to that, you get 2 awesome short rest weapon actions. Both of these don't list it in the wiki entry, but they do a ton of extra damage as well. They just do a bunch of thunder damage when you activate them. So you get Gust of Wind to knock enemies back and do a huge amount of thunder damage. You get a Zephyr Flash, which is a rush attack that does a huge amount of damage. So you get a bunch of AoE damage options as well, in addition to all of the base effects of the weapon. This weapon just does so much, and it does everything it does is great. It has 10 abilities, and each one of them would make this a great weapon on its own, and they're all on the same thing, making Nyrulna the best weapon in the game to just attack with, use as a passive stat stick on a lot of different characters. Unlike the Shar's Spear of Evening, you don't have to build around it at all. Any party can use Nyrulna, so it's going to go pretty much into any party, whether you have melee attackers, whether you have throwers, whether you have spellcasters, they can all benefit from this weapon. It's a one-handed weapon as well, so you can use it in combination with a shield or a dual-wielded offhand weapon. There's just so much to love about this weapon that it is going to do just any character that wants a weapon. If you use a weapon, this is probably the best one to use, and you should definitely consider it. And coming in at number 3, Markoheshkir. This is the best in slot weapon for casters, because again, just like an Nyrulna, which is the sort of best weapon for weapon users, Markoheshkir just does a million different things. Firstly, it's strictly superior to the Staff of Spellpower, which I rated in at number 11, so that should tell you just how good it is, because it has exactly the same effects as a +2 weapon with a +1 to spell save DCs and attack rolls, and Arcane Battery giving you a free spell slot, and then a hugely powerful ability on top of that. Cherished Favor, you can set it to one of the element types, and it lets you cast spells from that element type per short rest. The normal one to use here is Lightning, because that will let you cast Chain Lightning once per short rest, which is a 6th level spell. But all of the different element types that Markoheshkir can be set to have uses if you have builds themed around them. Of course, a Fire Sorcerer will want to use Fire, and you can do other cool things with the Cold or Acid versions of Markoheshkir, but the Lightning one is the normal version that you're going to set it to. For most characters, because Chain Lightning is just that powerful. It also gives you lightning charges, which is great. So usually you'll use that one. Once per short rest, an extra 6th level spell, plus once per long rest, an extra 6th level spell is a lot of free spells. And not to mention that this also just gives you a +1 bonus to save DC and spell attack rolls, which would already make it a great staff by itself. And it vastly increases your damage with the element type that you set it to, meaning that for any caster, it's just going to do a wild amount of additional damage. So much has been said about this weapon, and I've recommended it in every build guide going back for a year and a half, so I'm not going to spend too much time singing its praises, but basically, this is the absolute best in slot weapon for a caster. Any spellcaster is going to want to use Markoheshkir because it gives them a huge amount of additional value. And even if you don't have a spellcaster in your party, if you have no spellcaster at all, this still gives you a bunch of powerful value just from the additional spellcasts that you can get from Cherished Favor. You don't need a character that casts spells in order to use those. That's just a great amount of value as well. You also don't need to be an offensive spellcaster. You can use Arcane Battery for day-long buffs. The possibilities for this are basically endless, and Markoheshkir is just so great. I mean, there's just not much to say other than this is the best weapon for casters in the game, so every caster wants it. Now, it might surprise you that Markoheshkir and Nyrulna, two of the most discussed and most used weapons in the game, were only numbers 3 and 4. But when we talk about weapons number 2 and 1, you will understand. Let's do that now and talk about the second best weapon in Act 3, in my opinion, the Hellrider's Longbow. The Hellrider's Longbow is a bow that gives you a +3 bonus to your initiative when you are carrying it. You are not going to fire this bow, you're going to use it as a stat stick in order to increase your initiative by 3. Initiative is the most important stat in Baldur's Gate, even more so in Honor Mode, and in Act 3, a lot of enemies have very high initiatives. The highest initiative bonus in the game, I believe, is a +10. So in order to guaranteed go before an enemy with a +10 bonus to their initiative, if they get a 4, they'll get a total 14. And if you get a 1, you will want to get a total 15. So you need a +14 bonus to your initiative. That's not that unattainable if you have 20 dex and alert and the Hellrider's Longbow and +1 initiative. 14 initiative is a little bit overkill, but most characters in Baldur's Gate 3 should strive to have between 8 and 10 initiative at the end of the game, so you can guarantee going before almost every enemy, and the Hellrider's Longbow is a key ingredient in making that happen for non-dexterity characters. Initiative is just that important. When you go before an enemy, you kill them, and then they don't get to do anything back to you. And in Act 3, it's even more critical because the enemy abilities become so powerful and dangerous that if they get turns, they can often do terrible things to you. So stopping that from happening, or at least controlling them or controlling your spacing before they're able to do that is critically important. Because this is a bow with a passive +3 to initiative, it goes on any character that's not actually firing their ranged weapon. So any non-archer character gets the best bonus to stats in the entire game from this weapon for free, because it basically doesn't cost you a weapon slot or an item slot in order to use it. And the amount of value that's worth is incredible. When you get one of, I mean, we would absolutely dedicate an important item slot to a +3 bonus to initiative. We do that all the time with things like the Sentinel Shield. But not having to do that makes this ludicrously strong. Any character can benefit from a +3 to initiative to a tremendous degree, so everybody wants the Hellrider's Longbow. And what could possibly be better than a near slotless +3 bonus to initiative? Well, the honor of that goes to the #1 weapon in Act 3 for Honor Mode, Rhapsody. Rhapsody is a +1 dagger that whenever you kill an enemy gives you a stack of Scarlet Remittance. Scarlet Remittance gives you a +1 bonus to your attack rolls, damage, and spell save DCs up to a maximum of 3. So when you've killed 3 enemies, you get a +3 increase to your save DCs, attack rolls, and damage. The +3 damage is not particularly important, although it will increase the damage of multi-hit spells. Things like Magic Missile or whatever will get +3 damage to each missile. But the +3 to attack rolls means you're going to hit every attack vastly more reliably, and +3 to spell save DCs is incredible. So for any character that is casting spells, this is going to let you lock down enemies and instantly win combats because they won't be able to pass your saving throws. Whether or not you're using Arcane Acuity, this can let you reach saves that enemies can't pass if you have Rhapsody plus other increases to your save DCs. And with Arcane Acuity, it makes it very easy to reach saving throw levels that enemies cannot pass. So Rhapsody gives you just perfect insurance for Honor Mode, where enemies will not be able to succeed on saving throws against your spells, and you win combats instantly by locking them down with Command, Hypnotic Pattern, Hold Person, and the usual suspects for instantly winning combats when enemies can't pass saves. In addition to that, when you have 3 stacks, you can consume those 3 stacks for a bunch of effects. You can heal yourself. But the important effect, which mostly isn't useful, but the important one of those 3 effects is you can consume 3 to make your next attack a guaranteed critical hit. That not only guarantees a critical, it also guarantees that the attack hits. It just makes your next attack roll be a 20 on the die. So you get guaranteed hits and guaranteed criticals, so any character that's making attacks can use that to set up a huge amount of burst damage for a smite attack or something like that. Or a critical hit with a spell attack for a massive amount of extremely reliable damage. So Rhapsody not only gives you one of the most powerful passive benefits in the game, with +3 to your attacks and spell save DCs, making your character wildly more reliable, it also lets you consume that ability for another thing that just makes your character wildly more reliable. Reliability is the watchword on Honor Mode, and you'll have seen that as we have gone through these items, that the ones that I rate highly are the ones that make your characters work better, and nothing makes them work better than Rhapsody, which just makes everything that you do easier, smoother, and more certain. The more random things are, the worse. I say frequently that the enemy of optimization is randomness, and Rhapsody completely mitigates randomness when it guarantees that you hit, and helps vastly mitigate randomness with the huge bonuses that it gives you. Honestly, the numbers on this weapon are just too high, and so it just does more than a single item should, giving you bonuses that are just too strong for the game balance in Dungeons & Dragons, and so it is the best weapon in Baldur's Gate 3, and the best weapon in Honor Mode in Act 3. Alright, my friends, I hope that you have enjoyed this look at the 20 best weapons in Honor Mode for Act 3, and of course I hope you enjoyed the previous videos looking at Act 1 and Act 2. Definitely go check those out if you were just looking at Act 3. Act 1 and Act 2 itemization is more important than Act 3 itemization, so while you get the most powerful weapons here, the most important weapons show up in the Act 1 list, so go check that out if you haven't. And of course, feel free to leave comments if there is something that you think I missed, a weapon that you think I missed, from this list that deserves to be on it, definitely let me know. As always, I'm open to changing my mind if people have good arguments as to why something deserves to move around or should be here that isn't. Then I'm definitely interested in hearing those. I will say this was an extremely brutal cut to the top 20. There are like 10 or 15 weapons that were very close to making it that I had to very reluctantly cut from this list. So chances are, if there's a weapon that you think should be on this list, it just missed it. But there are so many good, because there's so many good weapons in Act 3. But definitely let me know if you think I missed something really important that deserves to be very, very high on the list. As always, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a comment of any kind and hit the like button. YouTube loves it when you hit buttons, so it helps me out with the algorithm, and I appreciate you taking the time to do that very much. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 build guides and other strategy game analysis. And if you really like what I do, then, you know, I, of course, really appreciate anyone who spends the effort to support the channel financially. Obviously, I don't take that for granted, and it really does mean a lot when people choose to share your hard-earned money. So thank you so much to the people who've chosen to do that, and if that's you, I really do appreciate it. All right, my friends, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you next time.